Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, honorable representatives of the Latvian people. This, I think, is my second time to speak to a Latvian audience. The first time was at a youth event organized some 10 plus years ago when President Bush was visiting Riga, and we had a youth transatlantic treaty organization meeting here. So very interesting experience for me as well. But to the issue at hand, my own experience, why I feel that I can comfortably speak to you on the issue of campaigns and elections, is threefold. During the last decade, I worked inside the Estonian political establishment in the capacity of a political advisor inside parties and government institutions, the Prime Minister, Ministry of Defense, the Parliament. I was political secretary for a party, did some campaigns, won a few, lost a few, so got that experience out of the way. And the last decade, I've been out of the public sector in the private sector as a consultant, as a managing partner and a founder of a consultancy that has been doing pretty much the same work, but on the other side of the fence. And in order to get my conscience, to have a good conscience and to be able to go to sleep, you need to do something good and give back to the society as well. So I co-founded a political blog, which is now the most read policy blog and political blog in Estonia called Poliitika Guru, where we, with some other civil servants and European Commission servants, Estonians, analyze politics. And also, I've been working with my company with the National Electoral Committee with the last 3 electoral cycles to consult their communication, both in the run-up to elections and during the elections. In order to understand what the risks are today for us, I think it serves to look at the history. And our history, as well as yours, is very colorful when we talk about foreign influences on our democratic processes, be it elections, be it referenda, or other political decision-making. And why it's important to look at the historical examples is because my hypothesis is, and it's not really a very fancy one, that most things have simply not changed. Pretty much everything happens with the same formulas, with the same patterns evident. I can begin my short, hopefully historical overview with 1990, May 15. The country was still not independent yet, or had not restored its independence. But what we had was seemingly a spontaneous attack of people living in Estonia on the Toompea Castle, which then was the home of the Soviet Supreme, but the future home of the Estonian Parliament. Also, as a follow-up, a terrorist bomb attack on the border guard headquarters, organized or seemingly happening spontaneously, organized by the people living in Estonia. But later on, of course, we found out that nothing really happened spontaneously, and not even by or because of the will of the local people, be they of whichever ethnic background. We found out pretty fast that always in the heart of things happening, there were local, usually local people of subpar intellectual appeal and subpar previous social activities, not very well known in any of the circles they moved around, who appeared to become politically very, very active and started having considerable effects around them. A good example is this Mr. Mikhail Lysenko, who was one of the instrumental guys who was organizing the workers' self-defense troops that attacked the Toompea Castle in 1990, that organized the terrorist bomb plots, and later on in 1993, when we talk about the spontaneous referenda organized in Ida-Virumaa, the northeast county of Estonia, we soon found out that it was the same guy, same instrument, previously completely unknown car thief from Tallinn, who seemed to be very, very active, having all the knowledge and assets to organize dissent, havoc, and at that time also, as you recall from your own experience, I'm sure as well, even outright terrorist activities. So I think the first lesson that I want to bring up here from these ancient times already is that although these were our own people, then more often than not it appeared very soon that on their own they would not have even dreamt of doing anything, let alone have the knowledge, skills, assets. This we always have to keep in mind when we right now look at our societies and suspect of our own people to plot against our democratic institutions. So these people always have oversight and coordination, management and mentoring. Later on, in 2007, some of you maybe were involved because of what you do or have otherwise connections to this. The 2007 Bronze Soldier riots. I worked at the Ministry of Defense at the time and had a few sleepless nights myself. These also were seemingly coordinated by the guys in the picture. I didn't want to blow up the pictures very, very big, not to give them more stage than they have already earned, but just as an illustration, they are there. Again, for people who seemed, who were previously men of mediocre or sub-mediocre capacity and capability, but at a magical time they were able to somehow come together, coordinate their activities, and create a lot of fuss. 2006, another example of how things used to work in the previous decade, and again I argue that they work pretty much the same in this decade. The Viva Presia festival in June, held in Tallinn. That was, I think, the 5th or the 6th time it was held all together for the purposes of the festival in Tallinn, held in our sacred grounds, the Bridges of Song grounds. An NGO was formed, run by a local Maardu municipality cultural coordinator and his friend, a surgeon. The embassy, and this is all now public domain information. This is not my knowledge, or I'm not saying something that is unknown in any way. The embassy directly petitioned businessmen who wanted to have business in Russia, and that's not just transit and oil businessmen or what we call the blue pipeline businessmen, but also regular businesses that had any kind of agricultural business, banks. They were all petitioned for funds for the festival, and later on, of course, and most of them did pay when the Russian ambassador contacted them himself, personally having meetings in addition to writing letters. They felt the need to pay up in order to sustain their business opportunities. What's important is here not the lesson of how NGOs fundraise. Well, the important lesson is that that particular NGO, of course, needed only a fraction of that money to organize the particular public event. Most of the money went to a party for its own political operations. That's called the Estonian Constitutional Party at the time, run or chaired by the same gentleman who was the cultural coordinator of that Maardu municipality. Of course, with him also, it serves as an anecdote, but an exemplary anecdote maybe, because similar things seem to have happened to men in similar positions as to Mr. Zarenkov, is that soon, having received this windfall of money, and not only in that instance, he seemed and became incapable of using it for the purposes that it was given to him, and also so he became indicted very soon and was convicted of stealing basically money from his own organizations for his own personal lifestyle. And we see these things happening also with several of these other organizations which have been trusted by their handlers, their mentors, with finances, assets, and knowledge to do something, and they have been stealing behind from their own paymasters. Again, the very same model was used 4 years later, and now we have people you can see on the slide whose names are also more recognizable to you as well. Centre Party chairman of the time, Edgar Savisaar, now also long time removed from the party and in courts for years already for several bribery and corruption related charges, and not for petty crimes but for considerable amounts of money already. But in 2010 it became evident that a similar model as in 2006 was used to raise money for Mr. Savisaar's campaigns. Seemingly an agreement was reached with his friend, the CEO of Russian Railways, that the Russian Railways will finance the Centre Party's political activities in Estonia via a donation made for building a church, and a part of that money then would be used for the political operations. Unfortunately, all that was caught on tape. Very bad for Mr. Savisaar's political fortunes. In 2009, instances of already quite direct influence on the Estonian political landscape. What is different, perhaps, of Latvia, in Estonia, the political organizations of the Russian-speaking ethnic minority have been always very fragmented, and none of the parties have been strong enough in the last 20 years to come over the 5% threshold. And it's obvious that people became very tired of this infighting between the different factions, and there was an attempt made by the mentors and coordinators of the smaller parties to unite these, and to unite these not just through moral lecturing that you need to cooperate in order to represent yourselves better, in order to be a stronger party, but also by providing incentives, material incentives. So again, money was both promised and used to the tune of 1.5 million. 1.5 million actually seems to be a magic number. It's always 1.5 million. It was the case with Mr. Savisaar, and now also with the coordination of the uniting of the small parties. And the mentor of the process was a previously less known external affairs specialist from the Moscow city administration. But again, as we've seen from previous and also in future instances, due to infighting of the local factions, due to stealing from behind their own, no agreement was made and reached, and still the picture remained very fragmented. So it was a failed attempt of using outside material influence to unite political groups together. However, things have changed a little bit, and it's hard to say whether it's for the better or for the worse. It remains to be seen. But many of these people involved in these NGOs at the time who tried to achieve their political fortunes through small Russian voter-based political factions and political parties have been incorporated now to the Centre Party. And several of these also serve as city councillors in Tallinn. Let's see if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Another example that I just want to talk to you about is much more complex, and it's the complex kinds that we need to be especially wary of. It is the information operation against the integrity of e-elections, we should say, not elections, not just elections. So the particular poster that you have here is already from 2013, not 2014, and it's a campaign, an outdoor print campaign, outdoor and print campaign that was organized by an NGO where there were several members of the board, several founders, one of which was an MP of the Centre Party, and I think she also might have been actually maybe Secretary General at the time, or at least Foreign Affairs Secretary. She still is an MP. And there was also an academic, a professor from the Tallinn University involved, and they ordered a campaign, commissioned a campaign against the integrity of the e-elections by just saying that they can delete your vote. And that was an introduction. But what's important here is that it was a mainstream political party that was attacking the country's own system. The story has a long background, and I know that the issue of e-elections raise emotions, and especially amongst security people, but not only within people who think about also constitutional affairs and democracy. There are legitimate people who are worried in the world, I mean, in a wider sense, about what effect or opportunities e-elections can have for bad actors. But in Estonia, yes, it was this political party, and the background is that when we've had the e-elections since the early part of the previous decade, in the beginning, it was politically understandable for the Centre Party to attack e-elections, because if we look at e-election statistics, then in the beginning it was definitely a thing for the young, educated voter. So from the point of view of the Centre Party, whose voter is 60 plus and Russian speaking, 60 plus Estonian or Russian speaking at the time in early 2000s, then it didn't make sense for them to support the elections because their voters didn't simply vote electronically or via the internet. Now, of course, it's actually much different. When we look at the 2015 and the 2017 election statistics, the participation statistics, and also post-polling, so if you voted electronically, how did you vote? We know that the representation of the population has grown broader and broader and broader. So now we have a proportionally very representative group of people who actually vote electronically. So we have 31% of the electorate vote electronically, and the political parties are represented quite equitably and quite proportionally. Still, of course, the younger and middle-aged generations are bigger groups in electronic voting than they are in other voting, but nevertheless it's become quite broad. 190,000 people vote electronically already, so it's a third of the voter base. But it made sense politically, maybe, to still attack politically, in a very cynical sense, it made sense to attack the e-elections or internet voting chance by the Centre Party. But what just seemed like a cynical move in 2013 became a part of something else in 2014, when other actors also joined these Centre Party MPs attacking your own country's electoral system, and not via political discussion, but via fomenting dissent and confusion in the population. I don't expect you to read this through. It is just a write-up, my write-up and my colleagues' write-up, because we were consulting the process at the time too. We had 2014, we had the European parliamentary elections, and in 2015 we had the national parliament elections, both in spring. So we had basically a 1-week crisis in 2014 when over a weekend a random group, a Finnish hacker, a US crypto specialist, a UK Green Party politician, and the Centre Party cooperated on joint actions to attack the credibility of the Estonian e-election systems. On Saturday, they sent out a press release asking everybody to come to a press conference, which took place then on Monday. There they presented their so-called reports, which in the end of the day didn't come out as super credible, but in the beginning you really had no way to prove yet before going through the report and analyzing it through specialists and getting them out. So also it was coordinated internationally. Their story went to The Guardian right away. Next day, on Tuesday, it already was in Washington Post. In Wednesday it was in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and so on. And I'm not going to describe the whole process to you. It's not really relevant right now, but I think that, again, what was important was, and it very much correlates what the previous speaker was talking about, that if what you have in place is a very integrated network of stakeholders already between both the private and the public sector, as well as the media, then the internal resilience of the system is strong enough for people to overcome these attacks. So, having teams in place, both in comms and in technical expertise, who can do 8-hour shifts in order to push back whatever is thrown at you in the media, is super important. Speed today in communications is more important even than being super precise in what you say. Being out there and rebutting and pushing out your own messaging. Another, I think, again, something that I picked up from Mr. Toffelson's presentation, where you saw also these slides and graphs and the organizational schemes of cooperation between the different agencies and departments. That is important, yes. But our experience in Estonia, it doesn't refute that, but it, I think, adds another layer of understanding of how and when does a country work very well in crisis time. And perhaps this is particular to small countries and cannot be replicated in larger countries. But what has helped us, both in that particular case or also a crisis that we had with the ID card last year, which I'm not going to go into in detail today, and what also worked in 2007 with the cyber attacks originating from the aggressor country next door. Why the country became or turned out to be resilient against these attacks was not the organizational charts or the written agreements between institutions. It was because there were informal networks of people who had practiced together, who had preached together, who had played together, who were a community. And this is the same both in ICT, in combating cyber incidents, as well as in communications. Because with the ID card issue last year, which we do not source or we don't put responsibility to an Eastern aggressor, it was something else, but a lesson nevertheless. But what worked there as well was that from, let's say, day 2, so to speak, you had dozens of private sector communication specialists coming together with the public sector, informally, voluntarily, working around the clock on both strategizing and then also execution, on messaging, pushing back, coordinating across all the public sector and the private institutions. So I think one of the key lessons is that, of course, you need also the formal agreements when you really need private assets to work for the government in times of crisis. But what makes it work is not the agreements, but is that it also exists informally, that these people, like yourselves, tend to get together. So I think it's one of my takeaways usually I used to be very critical of meetings like this. I don't know about this meeting particularly, but in Estonia, when you get together on an issue of ranging from foreign policy to security, you tend to have the same people. Sooner or later you start thinking about whether it's really beneficial to anyone. Does it have an impact? But when something bad really happens, then you find out why those meetings and these get-togethers by these very same people talking about the same issues often was necessary, because those people turned out to know each other then on a first-name basis and gelled together and worked around the clock without getting any extra payment for it, just out of the goodness of their heart, so to speak. And it's especially important. I think public sector people tend to have that higher calling quite often anyway, but you need to have those same networks with the private sector people so that they would get together and work voluntarily as well in times of crisis. What was the result of all that 1 week crisis was that elections and e-elections still seem necessary for the majority of the population, 2/3, and trust in other e-services, electronic services, is super high. E-banking 99%, posting taxes online 98%, and so on. So it would seem that the population has proved resilient against those discreditation attacks, although the party which was part of the process commands support from 25 to 30% easily, usually. I'm afraid I'm going to run out of time pretty soon, so I'm not going to dive into the Russian schools in Estonia group because you all know the issue. I think what maybe sets us apart a little bit is that, or maybe it doesn't, I think the experience that we've had has been much or somewhat more positive in the sense that despite the activities and which are clearly coordinated, then what has helped Estonia is that the people involved in Estonia have discredited themselves again due to some same issues, stealing from their own organizations, getting criminal indictments, investigations, infeuding personal relationships. And I'm glad in Estonia we have this movement called Back to School, or it's an NGO also that you can basically, and it recruits people like me, or people who used to go to school a long time ago, and then once a year go back to school to lecture. And it's a very wide and very popular thing. And I've made it a habit to go to Russian schools. I don't speak Russian myself. Most of my generation doesn't in Estonia. That's also something very, very different from Latvia, I think. When I meet my Latvian friends, 10 Latvians and 1 Russian in a group, they tend to speak Russian. But what I wanted to say with that is that going to these Russian schools, I hear from the Russian kids that what they want is learning in Estonian. And what they want is that their younger brothers and sisters start even earlier. And I thought that this was anecdotal evidence that they're just saying it to me because they think that kids think that it's important to maybe say something that the adult in the room will like. But polling and other less circumstantial evidence shows that as well, that while the group has been successful in the sense that it has created confusion, and 50% of Russian parents are angry in general, not about anything specifically, but at the same time, the Russian parents have started saying that they think that having their kids study in Estonian is super important for the benefit of the careers of their kids. So I'm not going to talk about that more. In the end, other activities to impact the elections, just what I wanted to point out, some of the things that bother me personally. Firstly is the CIS election monitors that tend to visit our elections as well, and which find continuously problems and issues with the integrity of our elections, and always at the same time, when autocratic regimes are having elections, they find that everything's fine. This just bugs me. It doesn't have an impact on our Estonian society, but it bugs me really. Second thing, what we've seen in the last elections, that Eastern neighbors are sending over VIPs to support our local Russian-speaking political candidates. Third thing that I want to point out, I know it's an issue in Latvia and Lithuania, less so, that some parties, politicians get free airtime in Russian federal TV channels. It is a big problem. In Estonia, it's under sort of public investigation, so to speak. The media is looking into this and it's becoming a hot topic, but let's see what can be done about it. Third issue, which is related to the increase of the foreign contingencies in Estonia, is the increase in attacks, information operations against the integrity of the foreign troop contingents in Estonia. Just last week, and the gullibility of the local media, the resilience of the local media is an important issue. If a local correspondent reports that somebody, next to a local store said that a foreign-speaking soldier, kicked a can down the road, then the paper ran a story about it. But the lesson here isn't that you should talk to the troops, that you shouldn't kick cans, but maybe the lesson here is that maybe the local store guy wasn't telling the truth, and you don't need to run those stories before investigating. Last point, ran over a couple of minutes. My perhaps most important takeaway for myself personally, and maybe because I've looked into this slightly more, is that what seems to be the most important thing for me to have in a country in order to be able to withstand these issues, these problems, these attacks and information operations, is if you have a working public sphere or not. And a public sphere, what started in these late 18th century salons, private salons in London and in Paris, and of course in that time it was the noble people getting together who had skin in the game. But when creating a public sphere for the first time, people who were not in power discussing public things. Now, when we talk about the public sphere, what I mean is that there is a joint, consolidated media sphere where the whole nation can discuss things. And this, because of the social media, but also because of the business models of the regular media organizations, has become very disintegrated, very granular. I think it's even a bigger problem in Latvia, for example. When I just look at the print numbers and the circulation numbers of Latvian papers, I see that the readership and circulation numbers are very low. So we have many different media organizations with their own followers, but there's no one single large media space where the whole population would be sharing views, information, and would create consensuses on particular policy issues. That is, I think, the key problem today, to have that single public space, as Jürgen Habermas pointed out already nearly a century ago, or not that much yet, but getting there soon. It's the public space that we need, because that provides the legitimacy to the whole political process of power. Thank you.